going up. Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, the podcast where we share concepts and ideas from Bowen family systems theory. The past 3 episodes, we've been looking at the patterns people use to manage tension in relationships. So we've looked at conflict, we've looked at distance, we've looked at triangles, and today we're going to look at the 4th pattern, which is over and under functioning. My name is Dixie Vandersluis. I'm a counselor in Manitoba, and thanks to technology, I can also be a faculty member of Living Systems. And Katie is here. She's the executive director of Living Systems in Vancouver and also a marriage and family therapist. Thanks for joining, Katie.
Thanks.
And our guest today from Toronto, Ontario is Avrum Nadigel. Avrum has been a marriage and family therapist for 25 years. He's completed postgraduate training in Bowen family systems theory. He's the author of 3 books: Learning to Commit, It Takes More Than Love, a workbook for singles and couples, co-written with Dr. Eliza Israel, and Where Would You Like to Start? A master therapist on beginning psychotherapy with families, co-written with the late Dr. Freeman. He also has podcast experience, co-producing 2 podcasts, Pop Parenting and the Love Examined playlist. He's also a musician, a songwriter, husband, father of 3 boys. And according to your website, Avrum, it says the caretaker of fish and a gerbil. And I was curious about the lifespan of the gerbil. Is this still accurate to your bio, or is that?
Well, first of all, I am not the caretaker. I am merely the victim of my kids and my wife's interest in all living things. So, but the gerbil is still alive. Yes, the fish are alive, and I have nothing to do with it. I just thought it's a nice way of sharing a more colorful, part of my family.
Excellent.
I appreciate today we're spanning the country too.
Yeah, 3 time zones. So today we're talking about the relationship pattern of over and under functioning. And it's a phrase people might not know, but I am certain it will be something that people have experienced. So Avrum, do you want to jump in with your elevator pitch?
So I'm going to channel my old marketing professors and keep it very brief. So this is what I came up with. I do for you what you cannot do. I do for you what you can do for yourself. We both feel pretty good about it until one of us does not.
That's fantastic.
Very good.
I worked on that one, Katie. So there's my pitch.
Good.
I, of course, will be much more verbose, as is my way. So I took it more to probably the reciprocal process in 2 people. And I believe this is mostly outside of our control or awareness, or not control, awareness. So I took it further with people responding in predictable ways where one takes over the functioning of the other. So when you're a small child and you're taking over the functioning of some of the things they're unable to do, this makes sense. But it gets more problematic, I think, as Avrum hinted in his that it gets into more problematic if it moves into a pattern in adult relationships. And the thing I have to say in my pitch is this is not a personality trait. I know we're going to talk more about that, but I really think that's something that gets misunderstood, is that this over and under functioning is not a personality trait, but it exists within a relationship.
Yeah, so important. Mine was a bit of a thought experiment. So I want you to imagine you're in a car. So for me, over and under functioning can be summed up as, with whom do I steer and with whom do I go along for the ride? How did we end up in our seats? And what would happen if we switched seats? So that was mine. And from Dr. Bowen, there was, so many descriptions. The parents and all the families have a constant pattern of functioning in their relationship together. We have called this the over-adequate, inadequate reciprocity. Both parents are equally immature. The one who makes decisions for the two of them becomes the over-adequate one, and the other becomes the inadequate or helpless one. The over-adequate one sees self as being forced to take responsibility, and the other as a shirker. The inadequate one sees self as being forced to submit, and the other as dominating. The terms, like you highlighted, Katie, the terms over-adequate and inadequate refer to functioning states, not fixed states. And I guess I should highlight, we use the title over and under functioning today. Dr. Bowen just used over-adequate, inadequate. Sometimes it's called dominant adaptive. I don't know if you guys would have other phrases you would use with clients, maybe that are less technical, or yeah. And what else stands out for you in all those pitches?
I mean, what I was thinking about just personally for me is how I could oscillate depending on where I am and who I'm with. So I underfunction, for example, at home when my kids are sick, which is interesting because when I was a camp counselor or I ran a camp, I dealt with sick kids and kids with injuries all the time and felt pretty good about it. But then my wife's a doctor, and so I outsourced all of that to her. And so she overfunctions at work and at home in that way, and she burns out, right, from taking all that on. I think it's how she regulates her anxiety too. She's in control. She's, doing the things that she's competent in. Mm-hmm. And I felt inadequate in that way, which was so strange because I was adequate 20 years ago when I was running a camp. Interesting, by the way, is we're all multi-generational therapists of some sort. When my mother once heard something about, I forget, I was saying how Eliza was an emergency with one of our kids. She goes, your father, my late father, when my brother and I were sick, he would get into the car, he would leave. He would leave my mother with the sick kids, get into a car and drive for like 4 or 5 hours. He just couldn't deal with it. And there was something about hearing that generational process that I was repeating a same pattern that snapped me out of this thing that was repeating in my own family, plus the theory. And I started to buck up and help out my wife at home. So there's underfunctioning in my house. I think I'm getting better at it. But then there's overfunctioning when I'm at work with my clients. So that idea that you can overfunction and underfunction, same person, right? Different context, I thought is just an interesting sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to punch up because you'll hear often about the person who at work is so organized and thoughtful and has it all together and can run this huge organization, and then at home they can't do their own laundry, right? Like like they don't know where anything is in the household. So I think that's so good. I really also liked how the unknown to known. I thought that was such a good example of how we can keep doing something, and in working on ourselves is when that unknown becomes known. I mean, I think the part that I was thinking that we may or may not have mentioned is the part that this calms us down. I'm an older sister. I think that, this is a very natural thing for me to take on leadership and to think about when I'm trying to work on this. My best example recently, I don't know if I'm kind of going on to the next thing, I was at my daughter's school was doing a Christmas play, and I got there and felt that things weren't organized in the way that I liked them in. And despite knowing that was my own discomfort that I was managing by standing up and saying, okay, I'll run this. Who wants this? I'll take this on. I'll do this. And I just felt so much better being in charge. And just, I think years ago, I wouldn't have seen that. Now, and this is an example where it didn't make me do anything differently. But I could see, like, I'm uncomfortable that this is disorganized and no one's really in control. And I can do that. That's the thing I can step up and jump into.
Yeah. And I guess thinking about none of these patterns are good or bad, right? Yeah. But it's the automaticness of them. It's how intense they are. One of my cohort commented that as a youngest sister of 3 sisters, she just gets in the back seat of the car. Like that's what she does. And it's sort of a benign, example. But when it looks much more, intense, it can become like a not helpful posture, right?
I think it was Michael Kerr's book, Bowen. Is it Bowen Family Secrets or Bowen Theory Secrets?
Theory Secrets, yes.
I think. Such a great book. He says something that's, I think, fascinating, and it bespeaks, Katie, to something you were just talking about the challenge of, even if you recognize it, it's really hard to get out of it. And he says something very interesting. I never thought about it before, but he said the whole over-under functioning thing is the over-functioner sees the under-functioner as the problem. Now, I see this in my office all the time. The over-functioner always is like, they're picking up the slack and they're not doing anything and blah, blah, blah. And that the problem, and the under-functioner agrees that I'm the problem. And it's very hard when people don't see their part, that when I get anxious, when I get anxious, but if I see it in you and you agree, it kind of locks it in place. Right. And I thought that was a very interesting observation by Dr. Kerr, because I noticed that with my clients in my practice, even if they get the theoretical part, they get locked into this thing. And it's hard to change. It's a hard dance to change.
Yeah, I found a quote that Bowen from the Origins of Family Psychotherapy, where Jack Butler talks about his early research. He talked about it, how the family gets locked into a functional helplessness. And I thought that was such a great way to describe that, right? Like that, you know, the other person is kind of thinking that each other is the problem, and they get stuck in that continued pattern of doing the same thing. So that's a good example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are other examples that you guys thought of, whether from your own life or clients or movies? It's kind of everywhere, isn't it?
I struggled with a movie for this one. I like to try and think. I couldn't get a movie in my head.
I got a good one for our next one.
Okay.
I can't quite think of the over-under. The only thing I would say about this is that this is where theory really does help. So just for me, for example, when I'm at work, you know, my tendency is to think cause and effect. I mean, I am an individualistic. Family systems theory only saves me from my primary thinking, because my thinking is cause and effect. And so if I'm resenting a session, or if there's a client and I'm feeling I'm getting all frustrated with the client, my upbringing is to blame something outside of myself. It's only theory that gives me a shot at this to remind me, hold on, that's a tell. My frustration is that I am over functioning in some way. Before I had the theory, I was convinced there's something in you that is driving me nuts. And now I'm able to take a step back. Again, to Katie's point, I don't know if I'm great in the moment. I have to be honest. I wish I could say I'm better at it. But in the moment, I find the session to end. I did take a couple of deep breaths, maybe a walk, go to the gym, and then I can kind of go, what the hell happened there? Why was I getting so reactive? Then I will come back to my notes from that client, put a breadcrumb for the next session to remind myself where I was getting triggered and where I started to overfunction. You know, my overfunctioning tends to be cheerleading, advice giving, frustration. And then I have a shot at some course correction and putting the problem back where it belongs. But it's only because of theory.
Right.
Yeah, I hear that. I was thinking, Dixie, do you want to go?
Well, I was just from that, in a profession like counseling, how much overfunctioning is expected. And if you aren't cheerleading, and if you aren't telling clients exactly what to do, you know, and you're viewed as underfunctioning, what do you do with that?
Well, I've had clients just point blank and say to me, you know, we did the Gottman method and they gave us the 5 steps and the 7 steps. I've had people say that to me, and I think I'm getting a little bit better, but not getting so defensive about why I don't have, the 7 habits of highly effective married couples kind of a thing. Like I don't. And so I try to be neutral with that and go, if it works for you, that's great, but, and I try to pivot back to whatever, we were working on. But yeah, people definitely are seeking out, 2 or 3 quick answers for very complicated, in my experience, problems.
And I just think that's such a useful way where I get I think theory is such a gift to me in that I want someone to tell me what to do quite often. I would welcome the opportunity for someone to tell me what to do in a situation. Hey, Katie, go handle your marriage in this way. That sounds great. But I've also had an experience where I've done that. I always think of a supervisor I had in college who used to tell me what to go in a session and say, like word for word. And I tried to do it. And then when the couple responded, I didn't know what the hell to do next. And that is the example that always grounds me, is if I borrow so much from someone else without putting my own thinking in, like I'm on such shaky ground. But man, the temptation is there. And I think that's where I just see, if I can just watch this happen in my life, it's so easy to see how it just happens in everyone's lives. All of us do this in relationship all the time.
Yeah, the phrase, the teach a man to fish, that old adage. I mean, that's kind of what I think of when I think of this process, that I could hand you a fish and we'd all calm down. But how is that what's that going to do? Which actually maybe leads, because I have an example with my oldest kid, who, of course, my job was to teach them to fish and all the ways of life, right? So my oldest, who's now in like late university, but a couple of years ago, I flew to the city where they attend university. And, I generally get stressed out flying. And so we get from the airport to a restaurant. And as we're sitting at the table, I decided I need to use the bathroom. And I asked them, oh, do you need to use the bathroom? And they're like, funny, Mom. I've been able to figure out when I need to go to the bathroom for the past 2 years that I have lived on my own, right? And we sort of just laughed at, this is what Mom does, all worked up from traveling, right? But it just flew out of my mouth, right? Without thinking at all. So
it's the good one of, I'm cold, here's a sweater. I had a couple examples that I came up with just thinking about. I think one of the best ways to just watch this is in siblings. If you have siblings, anyone who has siblings can look at their siblings and say, there's one that tends to follow this pattern. There's one that tends to follow this pattern. And I just spent a week with my family. So when I'm being pretty thoughtful, which doesn't always happen, I can sit back and just watch when I step in, when someone else steps in, and watch these patterns of over and under functioning. And what this time I came away thinking is the subtleties in it is, under which circumstances do I tend to stick up and lead? And it's often to calm conflict is the observation I made in this last week, versus if that doesn't work, I have a sibling who is just good at being assertive. And if conflict is not calmed and we need a fighter in there, she steps up and I happily step back. And just to watch that little dance, I think that's such, sibling relationships are a good place to watch some of these things happen. And if you don't have siblings, maybe your parents do, where you can watch who's the one who makes the decisions about grandma or grandpa, or who's the one who, sets up the family reunions, kind of watching that piece. That was my one example. My other example is to have a watch out. If you are a spouse who often says your partner is one of your children, that would be one of my tells to think about. The spouse who comes in and says, oh, I have 4 children. My husband is one of them. And I think that's, that would be one of those questions where I'd start to get curious with that client or friend and say, wonder what part you might be playing in the gentlest way to have your spouse show up like a kid in your household. So I thought those were 2 examples that people could look at in themselves or in their family to just get curious about where they might be functioning in their relationships.
And where would the pattern be in that person's family of being over responsible and in the spouse's family? That would be very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, well, usefulness of this idea. What I know for me, definitely, especially recording these past episodes, the idea that this is something in a relationship. It's not a personality trait. It's suddenly just sort of, I've clued in to that, which I know that we've been highlighting already, but that for me is one of the things. Like, I am not an overfunctioner in all situations. I am depending on who's in the car with me, I will, sit back or sit up. And what do you guys find how this is helpful and useful?
Well, I mean, one thing, I don't know if I read the question wrong, but I was thinking of a resource for people who are listening that would be helpful, specifically about what to do with this. One of the things that I found, Dr. Kathleen Smith's book, who I know you had on, one of your guests, in her book, Everything Isn't Terrible, she does a really good job at debunking the myth of burnout. You stop 20 people in a shopping mall and say, what's burnout? I guarantee you 98% will say, working too hard. Oh, my job, I just work so hard. Even before I discovered systems theory, I remember when, as a musician in a band, we would jam, we would rehearse for hours and laugh, and we worked hard preparing for a show. Never burnt out. Never. It was a joy to sit there till my fingers, like Bryan Adams, until my fingers bled, right? I would rehearse those songs. And then you just give me a 20-minute session sometimes with someone, my late supervisor used to say, you give me someone who sounds like my mother. He used to say this, by the way, David, whatever, I should, whatever, he died. So, I can say, yeah, he used to say, if someone sounds like my mother, okay, in session, 20 minutes in, he's like, I can't, with all the work he did in training with Murray Bowen, he said, I just can't. Right. And so Kathleen Smith does a really good job speaking to a certain generation about the overfunctioning concept and its relationship to burnout, and not how hard you work. And that idea of doing things for others when you get anxious, that it's actually, just use the word selfish per se, but it's this idea that this is for you. We can turn it into a virtue, I'm helping other people, but if you actually pay attention, it's actually how you get anxious. And then you start doing things for other people and you get Scooby snacks because people love it. Right, especially underfunctioners, right? And she does a really good job and some tips about watch what happens at work. And if you want a really long career, you better get better at this, or you're not going to last. I just thought her book does a really good job at discussing underfunctioning specifically at work.
Yeah, very good.
I had a couple about kind of the usefulness to me. I think I've already sort of said that I really think this is challenging to change, and thinking through how to see it and play around in it. So just that's one of the things I think is useful to me, is just to watch how hard it is for me to try to not volunteer for something or say, yeah, that project sounds interesting, I'll take on another project. But I think the other thing I wanted to say that was useful is there is really some research coming up about how this does have real consequences. Overfunctioners, in Gabor Mate's new book, he kind of relates this pattern where women, he talks a lot about, who develop cancer, who tend to have this pattern of being selfless and doing so much for other people at the cost of themselves. So I think, I don't know if I can connect the dots on that so equally, but to think about, there is a cost to this, I think, for people to get stuck in the position, and to think about there is flexibility in that. And we've just talked, I think, in the previous couple episodes about the other patterns that exist in the system. And I think one of the things that's useful to me in Bowen theory is to think, what other options do I have to manage my own anxiety, and not just use this one option in relationship of over and under functioning. Maybe I throw a little conflict in there. Maybe I get some distance to calm me down. But, and to think of that could be negative. But I do think it's useful to know there's other ways for a system to manage tension and not just get stuck in this one where I have to take it all and do everything. That I very much more relate to that overfunctioner because that's my often automatic in most relationships. So I have to really be interested when I start underfunctioning. I get curious. What's going on? What's happening with me in this relationship that I can start underfunctioning? Another, I think, good question that I think of for myself. But yeah, I think that to just to be aware that there are consequences, I think, to a system. And Bowen theory would say that's when symptoms develop. If we get so locked into a position and only one way of managing tension in that system.
Katie, it's interesting. I don't have the background to draw correlations between chronic stress and things like cardiovascular disease or cancer. So I'm not going to wade into that pool. There are other people in our field that maybe could talk to that. I know Dr. Kerr does a lot of work around cancer with that. But here's something that I absolutely observe. This is just simple. I notice to me when I get chronically anxious about something, and I would say when I'm over functioning, there's a stress response that I feel. If it goes on too long, I feel it intestinally. I can feel it in my tummy. Right? I can even feel it sometimes, and I don't know it in the moment. You guys ever notice you're working? Let's say you have a bunch of sessions. It's a really hard day. And then you go and just in your hips, like there's something, either your toes were a little bit tight, or maybe you were sitting in the chair. Yeah, shoulders. Yeah, there's something. And so that I can observe and that I can feel, and it's very predictable that there are physiological consequences of this chronic stress response and chronically functioning in a certain way that is helpful to me when I'm oblivious to whatever the hell is going on. My body will send me sort of say, now, Katie, if what Gabor Mate is speaking about is true, which is concerning, of course, but if there's something there, even more so important to catch it at its more shallow level as before it becomes a much more serious problem. And I think, what is it? Tummy, back, head, right? People get headaches, chronic back, tummy stuff. Lots of feedback.
That's listen to your system. I mean, I think that was one of my kind of takeaway things is I think, I feel like I say the same thing on every one of these podcasts. So at least I'm predictable. Is, how does one slow down enough to watch this in a system and create the opportunities? As I said, I just spent a week with my family. Could I step back and slow down enough to just watch what I do or don't do and what someone else does or doesn't do? I just think there's so many opportunities to see. And then could we try something different? Could I say no to volunteering to organize the Christmas play? What would that be like?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know I've worked somewhat hard to not turn into 10-year-old Dixie waiting for my parents to bring me Chef Boyardee while I watch the Flintstones, like every time I go home, right? But I mean, I think we all know this. We get there and we kind of jump into to whatever the pattern is, right? So even though I tend to be sort of the one who's on top of things, like you say, Katie, what are the times when, it doesn't matter if I'm late for this, or here, somebody else do that? And how can I be more just thoughtful of what goes into that? Or like my example of what would happen if we swapped out of the driver's seat and I was in the passenger, or I went from the passenger and picked up a bit. So
Katie, there's a tip or an idea that I heard that I thought was pretty creative from a colleague. I don't know if you know Lorna Hecht out in, I think she's in California somewhere. She once told me something that I've used. I found this helpful, where what she'll do is when she goes, you see, because Katie, in the moment, right, when you're in with your family, I don't know about you, I find when I'm in it, it's almost too late at some point, because I find I get caught up in the, in the emotional process of whatever's going on. And I'm like, think theory. And I'm like, I can't, because my mother, I don't know. I find I get very, as we say in Yiddish, farmished in my head, very confused about all this stuff going on. Lorna said what she does, and I've done this, and it's very helpful. She'll take a journal before she goes to her family, and she'll write down some sort of my best self idea. So I will think, I will observe in her journal, and she'll make some predictions. I predict this, that, and then she closes her journal. She goes and hangs out with whomever in her family. And then she comes back and she reports on, and then she has sort of like a pre-post-mortem kind of a thing. And I've used that, and I found it's much more helpful to me to walk in with a certain framework than walking in and going, come on, theory. Help me out here.
I heard much similar. I like that one. I heard Kathleen Colley. I watched a show she recorded years ago at the Bowen Center where she talks about she used to take like an index card of rules before she went to it. So she really, same way of like, how do I function my best? And man, I have found that so useful over the years. Like little simple things like I need to exercise. And that doesn't have to be like some huge thing, but I need to get out on a walk, do some movement in my body. I can go to sleep when I want to. This was one, I'm just back from my family. And this one is so useful to me to, I said the FOMO, I have like that, I want to be a part of everything. I don't want to miss a thing, but to give myself permission to go to sleep when I'm tired just makes me show up as such a significantly better person when I go on family vacations than the person who's like, no, everyone's staying up late doing this thing, and to just watch. I have a niece who's now going to be my best role model, who's only 10, but she is the kid who turns and says, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. And I just thought, look at that in her, the solidness to say, I'm tired, I'm going to bed, where her older brother is up there with the adults playing cards late at night, doesn't want to miss it. And I think, it's those rules have been really useful to me in my work and my family.
I mean, such a common popular phrase these days is boundaries. And I don't know what you guys would think about how that idea kind of fits into this relationship.
So Dixie, I think that could be a whole podcast. I have a big thing on boundaries about, I think people often think of boundaries as something that they put on other people, right? They shouldn't talk to me, or they're not going to interact with me in this way. Whereas I think, I think of boundaries and using theory as a guide to think about what am I willing and not willing to do. And, I think Jenny Brown does such a good job of thinking about this as in the realm of parenting, is what do I have control over? What do I have agency over managing? And that would be the boundary, right? I can go to bed. Right. I can make that choice. Now I'm a parent, so I have to make sure my kid is, also looked after and manage that, but I can choose to go to bed. I have that ability.
My sort of takeaway, I think it's Dr. Papero that came up with this question. I'm not sure where, but I know it's from him. What is the help that helps? And I have just, especially as my kids, like I've said, have next month empty nest, so 3 kids out in the world, and what I've noticed as there's some struggles and things they have to figure out in their early, late 20s, or late teens, early 20s. And when they come to me with questions, I just start texting, right? And because I've got the answer clearly, right? And my hack now is to just immediately delete it. I can't often stop myself from writing the text, but I can delete it and say, well, what do you think about this? Right? To get them thinking, as opposed to giving them the fish, right? So that question of what is the help that helps has been so helpful as a parent. And then, you could apply it to so many different areas of life, but that would be my one question for people to consider. Yeah.
I know Kathleen Smith's other book was mentioned, but her True to You, her new book, has 2 chapters, one on overfunctioning, one on underfunctioning, with loads of questions about things to think about. So I wanted to make sure that one was plugged in here. And my last one, I think it was I've heard it so many times, I actually don't know if Dr. Bowen was the one who said it, but the quote is, a good mother is in touch with the reality needs of her child. And I think that has been so useful to me, not just about being a parent, but about being a spouse, right? I think I like to help, as you've heard. And, when my spouse gets sick, he doesn't want me to be helpful. So what are the reality needs that I'm responding to my own anxiety about caretaking for him versus the reality needs are, he's able to take care of himself in that way. When he gets a cold, he can manage that. He's a grown man. And so to think about that has been a really useful statement for as a teacher, as a supervisor, as a clinician, as a parent, as a spouse, what are the reality needs of this person in front of me? Just like a clinician, I could take it in that example, right? If I have a person who's telling me that they have a plan and a means to kill themselves, that person's reality needs and the way I need to be responsible likely have just shifted. So to think about, I think it's just been so useful to me to think about. And I think it's Dr. Bowen that said it, maybe Dr. Kerr, but that one's always useful to me.
Well, that's been a very useful phrase to me, the idea of reality needs versus what my anxiety says needs to be addressed. And so I'm not sure if you guys want to say anything about reality needs and this over-under functioning in terms of, what am I thinking? Like, what am I thinking? Can somebody mind read and overfunction for me right now?
Well, I can't mind read, but one of the things that I have found helpful, and I don't know about you, I find what's helpful is getting feedback from my clients with certain terminology. God bless the late Dr. Bowen, but sometimes I wonder, people say he chose words for the layperson. I don't know about that. I find a lot of the terminology, or maybe it's a generational thing. I'm just kind of like, I got to read this differentiation of self thing 16 different times because what is he talking?
Right.
So what I have used, and the feedback I get from clients is, wow, that was helpful. And other things, it's not helpful, is feelings versus facts. So I'll say to a client, they're like, and I'm, my kid, this and that. I'm like, well, feelings and facts. Well, what's the feeling? What's the fact?
Right.
And they'll say to me, it's been really helpful just to sit there. I'm in a shopping mall and I'm worried about whatever. And I ask myself, is it a feeling or is it a fact? Now, it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't give you the answer, but it gets you out of always. And I happen to be someone who can over-respond to an internal anxious state of a feeling. It gives me a shot to be a little bit more mature in how I respond to something. And so that's something I use with myself. My clients have responded quite well to that. So, yeah.
That's such a good one. How to get factual.
Yeah. Because I think we're not talking about don't ever do anything. It's not like completely step back and let them flounder, right? But it's about basing it on facts, like you say, versus just these anxious feelings that just light up a relationship. So
I guess that's a good, I might add in that one. I think that, if there is some variability in this, some shifting, I think it's quite useful to parents to bounce in and out of the person who might be taking charge and not taking charge. I think that's been a real resource to me in parenting, with my husband, to be able to move in and out of the person, especially maybe if I've gone overboard in my overfunctioning for, to be able to have the signal of, I would say the timeout of, hey, maybe you want to step back, the tag team parenting approach to let someone else take this on. And I think that can be really useful in parenting to watch that balance.
Very good. Well, we have whipped through our time. It's gone by so fast. Thank you, Avrum, for being here. Do you have any other, final thoughts or life things you're doing that you want to tell us about that we can stay connected? Or
I think I shared everything I have to say about the over-under functioning concept. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks for joining. And as always, I hope that you'll find something useful, stir your own systems thinking as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.